Week 13 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few kickers I looked at off the wire this week. The first guy, Jason Sanders of the Miami Dolphins. So Jason Sanders available right now in 79% of fantasy leagues. He's on a high-powered offense with this Dolphin team. And over the last few weeks here for him, he's had at least 5 or more fantasy points is Sanders. The last couple games, Week 8 at Detroit, 8. Week 9 at Chicago, 5. Week 10 versus Cleveland, 5. And Week 12 versus Houston, 12. So Week 13, they're going to have to put points on the board. And I think they're going to have to settle for some field goals. Is this Dolphin offense, even though I know their offense has scored a lot of touchdowns this season at San Francisco, where their defense is vicious, one of the best defenses in the league here. And I think Sanders will have some opportunities in this ball game where they'll get in the red zone, but just not finish every drive with a touchdown. So I like him as an ad this week, available in 79% of leagues. Next guy's Graham Gano of the New York Giants. So Graham Gano, he's had a decent season here once again for this New York Giant team. I know I had an off game a couple weeks ago, but he bounced back with a vengeance with a good ball game at the Dallas Cowboys. Was Graham Gano with 11 fantasy points. So over the last few weeks here, he's been pretty decent. Week 8 at Seattle, 8 fantasy points. Week 10 versus Houston, 7. Week 11, he had a hiccup with 2 extra points missed in that one. And then Week 12 at Dallas with 11. So Week 13, Giants back home once again. Decent matchup versus the Washington Commanders, a division matchup where I could see both teams settling for a decent amount of field goals. So right now, available Graham Gano in 51% of fantasy leagues. He's definitely a kicker I look to get on the wire this week. The next guy, Jason Myers of the Seattle Seahawks. So available in 60% of fantasy leagues here is Jason Myers. And he's a kicker that's been great this season for fantasy football. And he's part of a pretty high-powered offense this season in Seattle with many weapons in Kenneth Walker, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, obviously. And the last few games here for Myers, Week 9 at Arizona, 8. Week 10 at Tampa Bay, 6. And Week 12 versus Vegas, 9. So right here, Week 13, a good matchup with the Los Angeles Rams. An indoor game, obviously. Rams give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And I'm surprised Myers is still out there in 60% of fantasy leagues because he's in the top 5 in scoring at the kicker position this season. The next guy's Ryan Suckup of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So right here, part of a pretty good offense is Ryan Suckup, even though this Tampa Bay team a little underwhelming and losing a ball game that there's no reason they should have lost at the Cleveland Browns in Week 12, where they only scored 17 points. But anyway, the last few weeks here for Suckup, Week 9 versus the Rams, 11. Week 10 versus Seattle, 3. Week 12 at Cleveland, 6. And Week 13 here, a good matchup versus Saints here that give up the 3rd most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So right now, Suckup's still part of a pretty good offense in my opinion. And he's available right now in 61% of fantasy leagues. And a kicker I would add this week, and the 5th and final kicker I look to get on the wire this week's Cameron Dicker of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Dicker, he was signed off the practice squad, and a guy that's going to be with this team for the majority of the season, if not the rest of the season, with Hopkins on IR. So Dicker over the last few games, Week 9 at Atlanta, 8. Week 10 at San Francisco, 11. Week 11 versus Kansas City, 9. And Week 12 a down game at Arizona with 4. But right here, Week 13, a great matchup at the Raiders. I give up the 16th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Another indoor game, which is always a great thing here, especially this time of season where a lot of games on the East Coast, heavy winds and bad weather, and Dicker right now part of a high-powered offense that's got healthy. Keenan Allen's been back now the last 2 games looking well. Mike Williams, possibly, he could be back here in Week 13. And right now, available in tons of fantasy leagues at 72%, so that's a few kickers I looked at on the waiver wire here for Week 13 of the fantasy football season.